The morning after my son-in-law's funeral, they changed the locks. Not a week later. Not after paperwork. Not after condolences dried up. The very next morning. I remember because the sun hadn't fully risen yet when my granddaughter called me. Her voice wasn't loud. She wasn't crying. That frightened me more than tears ever could. She said, "Grandma, they're inside the house." I asked her who she meant. And she answered with words no widow should ever have to say. Silas's parents. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just grief. This was something colder. They didn't come with coffee. They didn't come with comfort. They came with a locksmith. My granddaughter buried her husband less than 24 hours earlier. She was still wearing the same black dress, still sleeping on the same side of the bed, still reaching for a phone that would never ring again, and standing in the hallway of the home she helped build. Her in-laws told her something that still turns my stomach. "The house goes back to blood family." Those were the words. Not whispered, not explained gently, stated like policy. They told her her time there was finished. They told her she was no longer family. They told her to take her belongings from the boxes already waiting by the door. And then they said something even worse. They said she should feel grateful they were being reasonable. Let me ask you something because this matters. Have you ever trusted people who smiled at you for years, only to learn they were counting the days until they no longer had to pretend? Have you ever stood in a room you paid for, worked for, sacrificed for, and been told you didn't belong there anymore? If your answer is yes, stay with me. If your answer is no, you may want to listen even closer. Because this didn't happen to someone reckless. It happened to someone careful. Stories like this happen daily. Subscribe before you're unprepared. People hear stories like this and think they already know how it ends. They assume shouting. They assume collapse. They assume lawyers chasing lawyers for years. But that assumption is exactly why my granddaughter survived this. Her in-laws believed grief would weaken her. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed she would pack her things and disappear quietly. They were wrong. What they didn't realize, what they never checked, was the one detail that mattered most. And that detail would turn everything they planned against them. When they finished explaining why she had to leave, my granddaughter didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't argue. She stood still. She listened. And then she said one sentence. Just one. She looked at them, at the boxes, at the brand new lock on the door, and she said, "You're missing one thing." That's when the room changed. That's when certainty cracked. That's when everything they believed about control started slipping through their fingers. If this happened to you tomorrow, would you be ready? Subscribe. I'm telling you this story not because it's dramatic. I'm telling it because it's real. Because families do this. Because grief creates opportunity for people with no shame. Because legal documents don't protect you if you don't understand them. And because what saved my granddaughter wasn't anger. It was preparation. But before you learn what she did, before you see how quickly power can change hands, you need to know who she was. You need to understand why they underestimated her. And you need to understand why silence does not mean weakness. Before she became the woman standing in that hallway, refusing to move, she was a girl raised to notice details. A young woman who worked for everything she had. And a wife who believed love and fairness were the same thing. They weren't. And that lesson came at the worst possible moment. Let me tell you about my granddaughter so you understand why this story ends the way it does. My granddaughter, Ilara, was never someone who demanded attention. She didn't dominate conversations. She didn't announce her strength. She didn't need to. From the time she was a child, she learned to listen before she spoke. She noticed patterns other people missed. She paid attention to what was said, and what was avoided. When other children rushed forward, Ilara stepped back and observed. Some mistook that for hesitation. I knew better. She was learning the shape of the room before she decided where to stand. That habit followed her into adulthood. Ilara was raised with one rule I repeated often. Never depend on kindness when preparation will do. Her parents worked long hours. Life didn't hand her shortcuts. If she wanted something, she learned how to earn it. If she failed, she learned how to correct herself without blaming the world. I taught her to manage money early. I taught her to read contracts slowly. I taught her that being polite did not mean being passive. She carried those lessons quietly. She didn't announce them. She applied them. That's why people underestimated her. Silas's parents had expectations they never said out loud, but never stopped enforcing. They preferred pedigree over effort. They valued appearance over contribution. They liked people who reflected well on them. Elara didn't play that role. She didn't come from money. She didn't speak to impress. She didn't ask permission to belong. From the first dinner they shared, I sensed the quiet judgment, the way questions were framed, the pauses after her answers, the polite smiles that never reached their eyes. They didn't dislike her. They dismissed her. And that distinction matters. Elara studied engineering, not because it sounded impressive, but because she enjoyed solving problems with clear outcomes. She liked systems. She liked structure. She liked knowing how things worked beneath the surface. Not emotionally, but practically. When something broke, she fixed it. When numbers didn't add up, she found out why. When explanations felt incomplete, she asked again. She wasn't confrontational. She was thorough. And people who rely on control often fail to recognize that difference. Elara didn't marry Silas for security. She married him because they functioned well together. They planned. They shared responsibility. They spoke honestly when things were difficult. Their life wasn't loud. It wasn't performative. It was steady. They saved together. They worked weekends together. They built things together, including the house. That detail matters more than most people realize. Over time, the language from Silas's parents never changed. They referred to the house as his. They referred to decisions as his future. They referred to Elara as an addition, not a partner, not an equal, an addition. Elara noticed. She didn't challenge it, not because she agreed, but because she understood something they didn't. People who speak carelessly reveal priorities they think are hidden. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever been judged as not good enough by in-laws? Not because of anything you did, but because you didn't match the picture they already had in their minds? Have you ever felt evaluated rather than welcomed? Elara had. She simply chose not to react the way they expected. Elara didn't argue about status. She didn't seek approval. She focused on what she could control. She kept records. She asked questions quietly. She made decisions jointly with her husband, not through intermediaries. And most importantly, she never assumed good intentions were permanent. That's not cynicism. That's awareness. Once, years before Silas died, Elara said something to me I didn't fully understand at the time. She said, "People who underestimate you don't check behind you." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. Because the people who would one day try to remove her from her own home were making that exact mistake. Before she was a widow standing in a hallway with boxes at her feet. Before she was forced to defend what she built. She was a woman who loved deeply and carefully. And the man she chose mattered more than anyone realized. Especially his parents. To understand why they believed they could erase her, you need to understand the man they believed they owned. Let me tell you about Silas. Silas was not the kind of man who announced himself. If you passed him on the street, you wouldn't look twice. He didn't dress for attention. He didn't speak to impress. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew who he was without needing agreement. That was his strength. He listened more than he spoke. He followed through on promises. When he said he would do something, it was already done in his mind. Elara noticed that immediately. They met in college, both studying engineering. Not the glamorous kind of school people brag about, but the kind where effort mattered more than connections. They bonded over late nights, shared problem sets, and the unspoken relief of working beside someone competent. There was no drama, no chasing, no games. They recognized each other as equals. Silas respected Elara's mind. Elara trusted Silas's steadiness. They didn't compete. They coordinated. That's how real partnerships form. Silas loved his parents. That much was true. But love didn't blind him. He knew their habits. He understood their expectations. He recognized the way they framed generosity as leverage. He never spoke badly about them, but he also never confused approval with autonomy. Once, after a tense holiday dinner, he said something to me that stayed with me. They mean well, but they don't let go easily. At the time, it sounded harmless. Later, it would sound like a warning. Silas didn't choose Elara because she fit his parents' preferences. He chose her because she made his life calmer. She didn't push him. She didn't manage him. She didn't control him. She trusted him, and expected the same in return. That balance mattered to him more than approval ever could. When they talked about the future, they didn't talk about status. They talked about stability. A home they could fix themselves. Place they could stay. A space that belonged to them. They worked toward it patiently. They saved. They planned. They accepted help carefully. A decision that would later carry weight. Silas believed in fairness. He believed shared effort deserved shared security. That belief guided many of his choices. Silas's parents helped with the down payment. They never let anyone forget it. They spoke of it as generosity. They referenced it as wisdom. They framed it as protection. Silas accepted the help, but he never stopped paying attention to the language surrounding it. He knew money came with memory. We've all seen families like this. Stay with us. They believed Silas deferred. They believed he complied. They believed silence meant agreement. They were wrong. Silas didn't argue because he didn't need to. He handled things privately. When something mattered, he acted quietly and decisively. He didn't announce boundaries. He enforced them. Silas was careful with paperwork. He read everything. He asked questions that slowed meetings down. He made sure decisions were documented clearly. He disliked confrontation, but he disliked vulnerability even more, especially when it came to Elara's future. If something happened to him, he wanted her protected. That wasn't paranoia. That was responsibility. Silas's parents saw Elara as temporary. Silas never did. To him, she was the constant. That difference shaped everything. When he talked about the house, he said, ours. When he planned finances, he planned jointly. When he thought about risk, he thought about her. That perspective never changed. After Silas died, I watched his parents speak about him as if they still directed his life. They spoke with certainty. They spoke with authority. They spoke as though his choices were extensions of their will. That's when I realized something crucial. They loved their son, but they never truly knew him. Silas was calm, steady, and deliberate. And the house he shared with Elara was built on that same principle. But decisions made in trust can become tools in the wrong hands. And the help that once looked harmless would soon reveal its cost. To understand how that happened, you need to understand how the house became a trap. That house was never meant to be a bargaining chip. It was a two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood just outside Asheville. Wide porch, an old oak tree in the front yard, solid bones, worn edges, and a history that showed in the floors. It wasn't perfect. That's why Elara and Silas loved it. They didn't want something polished. They wanted something they could improve with their own hands. They talked about children there. They talked about aging there. They talked about staying. That house wasn't a symbol of status. It was a promise. Silas's parents were the ones who suggested helping with the down payment. They didn't frame it as charity. They framed it as efficiency. They said it would simplify approval. They said it would protect everyone. They said it was just paperwork. They never said gift. They said arrangement. Elara noticed that word. Silas did too. But they were young, optimistic, and focused on the future, not the fine print. That's how timing works when trust is involved. The documents came prepared by a lawyer Silas's father trusted. Everything looked standard at first glance. Signatures. But there was language buried deep in the paperwork that didn't match the tone of the conversation. It referenced the initial capital contribution. It referenced a residual interest. It referenced conditions that only mattered under one circumstance. That word never appeared in conversation, only in writing. And writing is where intentions often hide. Some people would ask why Elara didn't push back harder. The answer is simple. She trusted her husband. She trusted that anything signed together would protect them both. She trusted that marriage meant shared risk and shared security. And Silas trusted that his parents wouldn't use legal language as a weapon. That trust wasn't foolish. It was human. But I heard the words afterward. And I knew something had shifted. Within hours they asked about paperwork. Where the deed was kept. Where insurance information lived. Where financial records could be found. Elara handed things over because she couldn't think clearly enough to protect them. She believed cooperation would bring peace. Didn't. It brought appetite. Planning the funeral happened quickly. Too quickly. Silas's parents took control. They chose the service. They selected the speakers. They framed the narrative. Elara agreed to everything. She didn't have the energy to argue. That silence was misread. The night before the funeral, Elara sat alone in the living room. She looked at the walls they had painted together. She touched the banister Silas had sanded smooth. She realized something she couldn't yet explain. No one was protecting her. And no one was planning to. That realization didn't bring panic. Brought focus. Elara didn't stop hurting. But the pain changed. Sharpened. She began to remember details. Phrases. Documents. Moments she had ignored because life had been full and stable. She didn't act on them yet. She waited. She didn't sleep. She sat with a photograph from their wedding day. Silas smiling. Her laughing. She promised him something silently. That she would not disappear. That she would not be erased. She didn't yet know how that promise would be tested. But she felt it coming. Silas was buried the next day. The service ended. People went home. Elara returned to the house alone. She believed the worst was over. She was wrong. Because grief does not stop others from making decisions. Sometimes it invites them. And the next morning, the true intentions revealed themselves. Grief has a way of revealing priorities. Some people bring food. Some people bring silence. Some people bring themselves. Silas's parents brought folders. They arrived each day after the funeral not to sit with Elara, but to walk through the house. They opened drawers. They asked questions without waiting for answers. They spoke in low voices as if decisions were already made. They didn't ask how she slept. They asked where documents were kept. They spoke often about staying ahead of things. They said it was better to act quickly. They said delays created problems. They said everything needed to be organized properly. Those words sounded helpful on the surface. But the order mattered. They addressed accounts before emotions. They addressed assets before people. They addressed control before care. Elara listened. She was learning. They spoke of Silas in the past tense, not as a person but as a portfolio. His work ethic, his investments, his foresight. They praised him for being responsible. They never mentioned love. When Elara spoke about memories, they redirected the conversation. When she cried, they suggested rest. When she asked for time, they reminded her of urgency. Grief was treated as interference. One afternoon, Elara entered the study and found Silas's parents reviewing papers together. The door had been closed. They stopped talking when they saw her. His father smiled politely and said they were handling a few things. Not helping. Handling. That word stayed with her. They asked about insurance policies. They asked about the mortgage balance. They asked whether Silas had changed anything recently. They asked these questions repeatedly. Elara answered when she could. When she didn't know, they made notes. Not reminders. Records. Documents began moving without explanation. The deed disappeared into a briefcase. Statements were copied. Folders were labeled. When Elara asked for something back, she was told it was safer elsewhere, that it would be returned. Later never came. It wasn't what they did. It was how they did it. Their voices grew firmer. Their patience shortened. Their smiles faded. They stopped asking permission. They started giving direction. Elara noticed the shift clearly. This was no longer about assistance. It was about authority. One evening, after Elara struggled to finish a sentence, Silas's mother placed a hand on her arm and said something that still makes my chest tighten. She said Elara needed to pull herself together. She said decisions couldn't wait. She said Silas would want efficiency. Efficiency. As if mourning were a flaw. The study door was ajar. Silas's father was on the phone. Elara heard her name spoken casually, without warmth. He referred to her as the widow. He said she was not thinking clearly. He said timing was ideal. And then he used words Elara didn't fully understand yet, but felt immediately. Words about interest. Words about termination. Words about transfer. She stepped away quietly. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was alert. Elara did not confront them. She did not cry harder. She did not retreat. Something inside her shifted into place. She remembered conversations. She remembered documents. She remembered choices she and Silas had made privately. Grief was still there, but it was no longer alone. After that night, Elara became quiet, not withdrawn, focused. She answered questions carefully. She asked a few of her own. She stopped offering information freely. Silas's parents mistook this calm for defeat. They believed momentum was on their side. They were wrong. If this scares you, subscribe. Knowledge protects. They believed speed would overwhelm resistance. They believed grief would dull awareness. They believed silence meant agreement. They had waited years for leverage. They would not waste it. Elara did nothing. Not because she had nothing to do, but because she needed them to feel confident. She needed them to act without caution. She needed them to believe she hadn't noticed. So she waited. The funeral came and went. Condolences faded. And plans solidified. Elara didn't yet know every detail of what they intended. But she knew enough to understand one thing. They were preparing to remove her. And they believed she would not fight back. The next thing she overheard would confirm everything. By the third night after the funeral, the house had taken on a strange stillness. Not the quiet of rest. The quiet of waiting. Elara told me later that she could sense movement without hearing it. Doors closing softly. Footsteps that stopped when she entered a room. Conversations that shifted mid-sentence. She didn't imagine it. She was being managed. Elara wasn't listening out of suspicion. She was looking for paperwork. Silas kept certain documents in the study. Manuals, warranties, folders he labeled in his careful handwriting. She needed to know where things were now that he was gone. The door was almost closed. Not enough. She heard Silas's father first. His voice was calm, confident, controlled. The same voice he used when closing deals. The same voice he used when explaining why he was right. Elara froze where she stood. Not out of fear. Out of instinct. He was on the phone. Not speaking loudly. Not whispering. Speaking as though privacy was assumed. He referred to Elara casually, without her name. He called her the widow. That word landed heavily. Not because it was inaccurate. Because of how easily he used it. He spoke about timing. He said grief made things simpler. He said she was not thinking clearly. And then he said something that made Elara's breath catch. He said her position was temporary. He said her interest would end. He said the transfer could happen immediately after the service. Not might. Elara didn't understand every term. She didn't need to. The tone told her enough. This wasn't discussion. This was execution. He spoke as though the outcome was settled. As though Elara's presence in the house was already resolved. He didn't mention her consent. He didn't mention alternatives. He spoke only of process. Elara didn't move. She didn't breathe loudly. She didn't let the floor creak beneath her. She stepped back slowly until the hallway swallowed her. Her hands were shaking, but her thoughts were sharp. This fear was different from grief. Grief had made her hollow. This made her alert. Her mind replayed past conversations. The down payment, the documents, the refinance. Pieces she had stored without urgency now demanded attention. Something had been prepared. And it wasn't for her benefit. Elara could have walked into the room. She could have demanded answers. She didn't. Because people who believe they are unseen reveal more. And she needed them to keep talking. She went back to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. She stared at the wall. And then something settled inside her. A simple truth. They believed she was powerless. And that belief would be their mistake. She remembered a conversation with Silas from years earlier. Late night. Paperwork spread across the table. A discussion about protection. At the time it had seemed excessive. Now it felt necessary. She didn't yet know how it would play out. But she knew one thing for certain. Silas had not left her exposed. That night, Elara stopped being someone things happened to. She became someone who waited. She didn't pack. She didn't prepare to leave. She prepared to stand. As she lay awake, one sentence repeated itself in her mind. Temporary interest. She didn't know exactly what it meant yet. But she knew it was wrong. And she knew it could be challenged. The funeral was the next day. And Elara knew something the people around her did not. They believed the service marked the end. She knew it marked the beginning. Because once the guests left, once the final words were spoken, they planned to move. And so did she. The funeral took place the following morning. It was efficient, well-organized, flawless in appearance. Everything ran on time. Every detail had been arranged in advance. The seating was precise. The music was selected carefully. The program had already been printed. Nothing felt spontaneous. Nothing felt personal. Grief was present, but only where it was allowed. Elara sat in the front row as expected. But no one sat beside her. Silas's parents took positions slightly ahead, closer to the aisle. They greeted guests. They accepted condolences. They nodded with solemn approval. Elara remained still. She folded her hands in her lap. She watched people speak about her husband as if she were not there. Silas's father spoke at length. He talked about discipline. He talked about legacy. He talked about responsibility. He described Silas as a man shaped by values passed down. He did not mention Elara. Not once. Not the marriage. Not the home they built. Not the life they shared. It was as if her role had been erased from the story being told. Elara told me later that she felt separate from the room. Not numb. Removed. She listened as if the words were being delivered about a stranger. She recognized facts but not meaning. This was not the farewell she had imagined. This was a presentation. When Elara lowered her head, she felt eyes on her. When she wiped her face, she felt assessed. She wasn't allowed to break down. She wasn't allowed to disappear. Her grief had to fit within acceptable boundaries. Anything more would be inconvenient. Friends from college attended. Neighbors came. Some offered brief hugs. But no one stayed. No one lingered beside her afterward. Silas's parents guided the flow of people away from her. They thanked guests. They closed conversations. They moved the moment along. During the service, Elara noticed something that confirmed her fears. Silas's parents weren't grieving. They were concluding something. Their posture was firm. Their movements purposeful. They behaved like people who had completed a task, not people who had lost a son. At one point, Silas's mother glanced toward Elara. The look was brief, cold, not hostile, decisive. It wasn't sympathy. It was finality. That was when Elara understood something without needing words. This service was not the end of their involvement. It was the beginning of their action. When the last guest departed, The space emptied quickly. The flowers remained. The chairs stood aligned. But the warmth vanished. Silas's parents didn't stay long. They said they were exhausted. They said tomorrow would be busy. Tomorrow. That word carried weight. Ilara returned to the house alone. She removed her shoes at the door. She set her purse down where it always went. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. She told me later that she made a quiet decision that afternoon. She would not leave that house without a fight. She would not accept being removed quietly. She would not let grief be used against her. She didn't know exactly what was coming, but she knew it would arrive soon. That night passed without sleep. The house remained still. The lock stayed unchanged. For now, Ilara believed she had one more morning. She believed she would be allowed time. She believed wrong. Because the next sound she heard was not a knock. It was metal turning where metal had never turned before. The morning after the funeral did not begin with voices. It began with metal. A sharp, unfamiliar sound at the front door. Firm, deliberate, final. Ilara was standing in the kitchen, still wearing the black dress from the day before. She hadn't slept. She was holding a cup of coffee she hadn't tasted. When the sound came again, clearer this time, her body reacted before her mind did. That was not the sound of a key she recognized. Ilara stepped toward the entryway slowly. Standing inside the house were Silas's parents. They were not alone. A locksmith knelt near the door. A large man stood beside him, arms folded, eyes forward. A new lock gleamed where the old one had been. No greeting, no explanation, just action already completed. Silas's mother was holding boxes. Not random ones, organized ones. Shoes in one, clothes in another. Personal items stacked neatly, as if Ilara's life could be categorized and cleared. She had packed them. Before Ilara knew they were coming. That detail mattered. Silas's mother spoke first. Her voice was calm. She said, "Your time here is over." Then she added, "We need the house secured." Silas's father stepped forward. He looked around the room with ownership that did not belong to him. And then he said it. "The property goes back to blood family." Not discussion. Not negotiation. Declaration. They told Ilara she could take her furniture. They said they were being reasonable. They said this was best for everyone. They said Silas would have wanted it this way. That was the lie that burned the deepest. Ilara told me later that the room felt unsteady. Not spinning. Shifting. Her chest tightened. Her hands went cold. Her vision narrowed. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She planted her feet. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected her to gather what remained and disappear quietly. That expectation shaped their confidence. They believed grief had finished its work. They were wrong. Ilara said nothing at first. She looked at the boxes. She looked at the new lock. She looked at Silas's father. And she waited. The silence stretched. The locksmith shifted uncomfortably. Silas's father frowned. He did not like pauses he did not control. "Before I tell you what she said next, let me ask you something honestly. Tell me, would you have broken down or stood firm? Because that moment decides everything." Silas's mother set one box on the floor. The sound was soft, controlled, as if she were placing something finished. That was when Ilara lifted her head. Not in anger, in clarity. "If you're still not subscribing, comment why. I want to know." Something changed in Ilara at that moment. The pain did not vanish. Focused. She remembered conversations. She remembered paperwork. She remembered choices made quietly years earlier. She realized they had made one critical mistake. Ilara looked directly at Silas's father. Not with fear. With assessment. He saw it. And for the first time that morning, his confidence faltered. Ilara inhaled slowly. She spoke calmly, evenly. She said, "You're missing one thing." The room froze. Silas's father laughed lightly. He asked what she meant. He offered to arrange a moving truck. He suggested storage. He framed resistance as inconvenience. He still believed he was in control. They had planned everything except her response. They had prepared documents. They had secured access. They had counted on silence. What they had not prepared for was awareness. Ilara did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She let them finish speaking. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress. The room waited. So did they. What she held would change everything. They believed the locks made them powerful. They believed the boxes made the decision final. They believed blood decided ownership. They were about to learn how wrong that belief was. Because the thing they missed was not emotion. It was preparation. When Ilara said those words, no one moved. Not Silas's parents. Not the locksmith. Not the man standing by the door. You are missing one thing. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. That's what unsettled them. People who believe they have won do not expect calm resistance. They expect delay, denial, panic. They got none of that. Silas's father adjusted his tie and sighed, as if dealing with a mild inconvenience. He asked Ilara what she thought she meant. He spoke slowly, as though explaining something to a child. He reminded her of paperwork. He reminded her of agreements. He reminded her of reality. He believed explanation would end the conversation. Didn't. Ilara let him speak. She didn't correct him. She didn't argue details. She didn't rush the moment. People reveal the limits of their knowledge when they talk long enough. She needed him to finish. Silas's parents assumed the past was fixed. They assumed documents never changed. They assumed authority remained static. They assumed silence meant ignorance. They never asked what had happened since the house was purchased. They never checked. They believed they didn't need to. When Ilara finally spoke again, her tone remained steady. She told Silas's father he was correct about one thing. There had been an agreement. That acknowledgement confused him. Agreement was supposed to end resistance, not invite it. He paused, just long enough. Ilara said something simple. She said the agreement he was referring to no longer applied. The smile disappeared. He told her that wasn't possible. He said changes required consent. He said nothing could be altered without his involvement. That certainty was familiar and dangerous. Silas's father had spent decades being obeyed. People deferred. Banks listened. Lawyers followed instruction. He mistook that pattern for permanence. He mistook influence for immunity. Ilara recognized the mistake immediately. Instead of responding, Ilara reached into the pocket of her dress. She did it slowly. No sudden movements. No urgency. Just enough to make everyone watch. The locksmith straightened. The man by the door shifted his weight. Silas's mother tightened her grip on the remaining boxes. Something was happening. They could feel it. Ilara didn't show what she held yet. She asked Silas's father a question instead. Simple one. She asked whether he had reviewed any updated filings in the last 3 years. He scoffed. He said there had been no updates. That answer told her everything she needed to know. Silas's father said he had records. He said he had copies. He said the law was clear. He said Ilara was exhausting herself. That was when Ilara nodded. Not in agreement, in confirmation. For the first time that morning, Ilara addressed him directly. She said his name. Not with anger, with clarity. She told him he had been so focused on protecting his interests that he failed to notice what Silas had done. That sentence landed hard. Silas's name did not usually appear in sentences that challenged authority. Silas's father asked what she meant. Not calmly, sharply. The question came too quickly. That was the moment I knew, even from a distance, that something had shifted. People who are certain do not rush. Ilara understood timing. She knew revealing too much too soon would invite interruption. So she revealed nothing yet. She reminded him of a refinance. Routine 1. Nothing dramatic. Just paperwork handled quietly between husband and wife. His face changed. The locksmith looked from one face to another. The man by the door no longer looked bored. Silas's mother stopped stacking boxes. The room was no longer united behind authority. It was waiting for proof. Ilara unfolded the document she had been holding. Not fully. Just enough for the heading to be visible. She placed it on the hall table. Not pushed. Placed. She rested her finger over one line. Name. Ilara asked Silas's father one last question. She asked whether he had ever checked public records after the refinance. The silence that followed was complete. He did not answer. Because there was no answer that saved him. Ilara didn't smile. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain yet. She let the document speak without words. And in that moment, the power they thought they held slipped from their grasp. What Silas had done, quietly, carefully, was about to be understood. And it would change everything. Ilara didn't rush the moment. She left the paper resting on the hall table. Her finger placed lightly over her name. Not pointing. Not pressing. Just present. Silas's father leaned forward first. Not confidently. Carefully. His eyes moved across the page, scanning for familiarity. Headings. Filing marks. What he found unsettled him. 'Cause the document was real. And it was current. Ilara explained only what was necessary. Years earlier, she and Silas had refinanced the house. Not to escape responsibility. Not to hide anything. To improve their position. They had paid consistently. They had built equity. They had earned leverage of their own. The refinance replaced old paperwork. All of it. Every condition tied to the original purchase. That was the part Silas's parents never confirmed. During that refinance, Silas made a decision. Not out of fear. Out of clarity. He instructed the bank to record a transfer on death deed. One that named Ilara, and only Ilara, as the beneficiary of the property. No joint ownership disputes. No estate delays. No external claims. The house would pass directly to her. Immediately. Silas's mother dropped the boxes she was holding. Not dramatically. They simply slipped from her hands. The sound was dull. Final. The locksmith took a step back. The man by the door stopped watching Ilara and started watching Silas's father. Because something irreversible had entered the room. Ilara told them why they hadn't known. Silas understood control. He knew that if his parents were informed, they would object. They would apply pressure. They would demand involvement. So he protected his wife quietly. Not with confrontation. With preparation. Silas's father objected immediately. He said the original agreement still applied. He said his contribution gave him standing. He said this would be challenged. Ilara listened. Then she corrected him. The transfer on death deed bypassed probate entirely. The house never entered the estate. It moved directly to her. No challenge applied. That was the point. Silas's father read the document again. Slower this time. He looked for loopholes. There were none. He looked for omissions. There were none. He looked at the filing stamp. It was dated 3 years earlier. He had missed it completely. Silas's mother spoke next. Not to argue, to confirm. She asked whether the document had already taken effect. Ilara answered simply. It had activated that morning, when Silas's death certificate was filed. The house was already hers. Ilara reminded them of something else. They were standing in her home. They had entered without permission. They had changed her locks. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. The word trespassing carries its own weight. The locksmith asked to see the document. Ilara handed it to him. He didn't read every line. He didn't need to. He saw the filing. He saw the name. He packed his tools without argument. And he left. The man by the door stepped away from the entry. Not toward Ilara. Away from Silas's parents. He understood where risk had moved. Silas's parents stood alone. He threatened lawsuits. He said this wasn't over. He said time favored him. Ilara met his eyes. She told him time had already chosen. The law was settled. Most people never prepare. Subscribe, don't be most people. Ilara gestured toward the new lock. She thanked them for upgrading it. She said it made the house safer. For her. That was the moment Silas's father understood the depth of his miscalculation. They had planned privacy. They had planned compliance. Instead, they were exposed. To workers. To witnesses. To reality. Nothing damages authority faster than public correction. Ilara gave them 5 minutes to gather any belongings they had brought. Then she would call the police. Her voice did not shake. She didn't insult them. She didn't threaten them. She didn't shout. She let preparation speak. She let entitlement collapse under its own weight. Silas's parents left the house in silence. The door closed behind them. This battle was finished. But consequences were just beginning. Because when people lose control, they don't always accept it quietly. When the front door closed behind Silas's parents, the sound echoed longer than it should have. Not because it was loud. Because it marked an ending they hadn't planned for. Ilara stood still for several seconds after they left. She didn't rush to sit down. She didn't lean against the wall. She simply listened. The house felt different now. Not empty. Cleared. Ilara did not collapse. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She understood something important. People who lose control often return to reclaim it. She needed the house calm, prepared. Calling them trespassers wasn't about punishment. It was about truth. They had entered without consent. They had changed locks without authority. They had treated her grief as permission. Naming that behavior correctly stripped it of justification. They were no longer elders. They were no longer decision makers. They were outsiders. Ilara examined the new lock they had installed. It was solid, expensive, secure. She tested it twice. It worked perfectly. They had paid for her safety. That irony did not escape her. By then, neighbors had begun to notice. A locksmith leaving quickly. A security guard stepping away. 2 well-dressed adults exiting without dignity. No explanations were offered. None were needed. People notice when power changes hands. Silas's parents didn't argue on the porch. They didn't raise their voices. They understood they had lost. Arguing would draw attention. And attention was no longer on their side. Ilara gathered the boxes they had packed. She carried them upstairs. Not angrily, deliberately. She unpacked them slowly, returning each item to its place. Shoes back into the closet, clothes back into drawers. Her life restored piece by piece. This mattered. It wasn't about objects. It was about presence. Later that afternoon, Ilara contacted her attorney. Not to escalate, to document. She explained what had happened. Every detail. Because control regained without record can be challenged. She wasn't making that mistake. That night, Ilara slept in the center of the bed. For the first time since Silas died. She didn't dream. She rested. The house held her differently now. Silas's parents didn't lose money that day. They lost certainty. They lost narrative control. They lost the belief that grief equals weakness. That kind of loss lingers. Within days, messages arrived. Short ones, careful ones. They asked for discussion. They suggested mediation. They wanted privacy back. Ilara did not respond. Not yet. She understood now how they operated. Pressure first. Politeness second. Persistence always. Waiting denied them momentum. Silence unsettled them more than refusal. When I visited later that week, Ilara looked different. Not healed. Steady. She walked through the house without hesitation. She belonged there again. The house was secure. The law was settled. The confrontation was over. But revenge doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles quietly into place. And sometimes, dignity is the sharpest outcome of all. What Elara did next wasn't dramatic, but it was decisive. People think revenge has to look a certain way. They expect shouting. They expect courtroom battles. They expect destruction. What Elara chose was different. She chose peace on her terms. And that decision unsettled Silas's parents more than any confrontation ever could. Elara returned to routine slowly. She made coffee in the morning. She watered the plants Silas had planted. She opened windows without fear of interruption. These small acts mattered. They restored order. They reminded her and anyone watching that she was not leaving. Elara didn't send messages. She didn't announce victory. She didn't speak badly about them. She understood something most people miss. People who are used to power feel humiliation most deeply when no one acknowledges their loss. Silence denied them reaction. And reaction was what they wanted. That lock remained on the door. Elara never replaced it. She let it stand as it was. Every time she turned the key, she remembered who had installed it and why. They had tried to secure the house against her. Instead, they secured it for her. That irony stayed. When Silas's parents finally reached out again, their tone had changed. No demands, no assumptions, no authority. They asked to talk. They asked to explain. They asked for understanding. Elara didn't respond immediately. She let the silence speak first. When Elara eventually replied, her message was brief. She acknowledged receipt. She stated her position. She said communication would go through her attorney. Nothing more. No emotion. No invitation. That boundary closed the door they kept trying to reopen. The house was valuable, but control was priceless to them. And control was what they had lost. They could no longer decide. They could no longer direct. They could no longer frame the story. They had been removed from the center. That absence echoed louder than anger ever could. Elara kept the house exactly as it was. She didn't erase him. She didn't freeze time either. She allowed life to continue carefully. She fixed what needed fixing. She maintained what mattered. She lived there. That was the promise she had made. When I visited weeks later, I noticed something new. Elara no longer looked over her shoulder. She walked with certainty, not arrogance, certainty. She had learned something through loss, not bitterness but clarity. No property was destroyed. No insults were traded. No lines were crossed. The damage came from exposure. From the moment entitlement met preparation. From the realization that silence does not mean surrender. This story doesn't end with cheering. It ends with balance restored. With dignity reclaimed. With a woman standing in her own home, not because she fought loudly, but because she planned carefully. The locks were secure. The house was quiet. And the people who believed blood entitled them to everything had been corrected. What remains now is the lesson. Not just for Elara. For anyone listening. Because this kind of story doesn't exist to entertain alone. It exists to warn. People will hear this story and think it's about property. It isn't. The house was only the stage. What truly mattered was what people believe they are entitled to when loss enters the room. Grief does not change character. It reveals it. Silas's parents didn't become different people after his death. They became clearer. They used the phrase blood family as if it were a shield. As if biology alone justified removal, control, and erasure. But blood does not automatically mean care. And marriage does not automatically mean vulnerability. Family is not who arrives with paperwork. Family is who protects you when you can't protect yourself. Silas understood that. That is why he acted. The most expensive mistake they made was assuming quiet meant confusion. They believed Elara's grief erased her awareness. They believed calm meant surrender. They believed patience meant ignorance. They were wrong on all counts. Silence is often where preparation lives. Some people think planning for the worst is pessimistic. It isn't. It's protective. Silas didn't plan because he feared death. He planned because he loved his wife. He understood something many people avoid. Good intentions don't survive conflict without structure. Love needs paperwork when other people lack restraint. Entitlement relies on assumptions. Assumptions that no one will check. Assumptions that authority goes unchallenged. Assumptions that grief silences resistance. The moment someone asks the right question, entitlement collapses. Not loudly, quietly. If you are married, understand this. Love does not override legal reality. If you own property, understand this. Time does not protect you from conflict. If you trust people, understand this. Trust without verification creates opportunity for harm. These are not comfortable truths, but they are necessary ones. Elara did not destroy anyone. She did not humiliate them publicly. She did not seek punishment. She allowed their actions to meet consequence. That kind of outcome lasts longer than anger, because it teaches restraint. Now let me ask you something that divides people every time this story is told. Were they evil or just greedy? Some will say grief clouded their judgment. Others will say opportunity exposed intent. There is no easy answer. And that's the point. This didn't happen because Elara was careless. It happened because she was human. Because she trusted family. Because she believed fairness was shared. That belief is common. And that's why stories like this repeat. When it was over, I told Elara something I'll share with you now. I told her this. Never confuse kindness with obligation. She understood. And she has lived differently ever since. I didn't tell you this to frighten you. I told you this to prepare you. Because the people who think this would never happen to me are always the ones least ready when it does. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not an accident. Discomfort is where awareness begins. And awareness is what prevents regret. If you won't subscribe, tell me why. The house still stands. The locks still hold. And the people who believed they could erase someone from her own life learned a lesson they will never forget. Preparation outlasts entitlement. And silence, when chosen carefully, can be louder than any argument.